Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be tackling a pretty big topic, social contract theory.
Sounds intimidating.
It kind of does, right? But trust me, it's actually a lot more interesting than it sounds. We're really going to be getting into, why we follow rules and how those rules make up our societies. We've got a bunch of great sources to help us unpack all of this, including the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that it's not just some abstract concept, that philosophers came up with centuries ago. It really is still super relevant to all the stuff that's going on today, all the debates we have about taxes, individual freedom, you name it.
I mean, it's almost like a giant puzzle, right? Like trying to figure out what holds societies together and what makes us agree to these rules, even though we're not literally signing a contract.
You got it. And the Stanford Encyclopedia actually does a great job. It lays out these 5 key elements of social contract theory, and I think they really help us wrap our heads around this complex idea. Like the first one is the role of the social contract, which is a pretty good place to start.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What exactly is the main point of this contract idea? What are we trying to figure out here?
Well, it all comes down to understanding why we should follow social rules. What's the justification for laws, institutions, moral principles, all that stuff.
So it's not just about what the rules are, but why we should actually give a hoot about following them.
Exactly. Why not just be a total knave, as some philosophers call it? Someone who just looks out for themselves regardless of the rules.
Right, so is that where the whole self-interest thing comes in with social contracts? Is that the assumption?
It's a really important part of the debate. So you have folks like Hobbes and Locke who are considered contractarians, right? And their argument is that even if you're totally selfish, you still benefit from having a system of rules. It's about self-preservation, because nobody wants to live in a world where they're constantly afraid of getting cheated or attacked or whatever.
So even if you're a super cynic, there's still a practical reason to go along with the rules, right? It just makes life easier.
Yeah. But then there are the contractualists, people like Rousseau and Kant, and they have a bit of a different take on things. They think that people are capable of more complex moral reasoning, and that's what drives the social contract. It's not just about avoiding chaos. It's about upholding principles that respect everyone.
Okay, so it's less about a cold calculation and more about a shared sense of right and wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you think, which side seems more convincing? Are we mostly driven by self-interest, or do we have some kind of built-in sense of fairness and obligation to each other?
Tough question. Both sides have good points. It's we're trying to figure out the recipe for a good society with self-interest and morality as the main ingredients.
That's a great analogy. So now the second element that Stanford Encyclopedia highlights is modeling the parties. And this is where things start to get really fascinating.
Modeling the parties. Okay, so who are these parties we're talking about? Are we talking about the founding fathers sitting around a table writing up a new constitution?
Not quite. It's more like creating this hypothetical model of how rational people would come together and decide on what principles should govern them.
So it's a thought experiment. We're imagining these perfect people who represent us in this big decision-making process.
Exactly. But the trick is we want these hypothetical people to be realistic and reflect the different motivations that actual humans have. But they also need to be, a bit idealized, capable of making rational, fair decisions.
So finding that balance, right, between the messiness of real life and the aspirations of what a perfect society could be.
Yeah, it's tough. It's this tension between wanting the model to be robust, like it works, even if people aren't perfect, but also sensitive, so it reflects how people actually think.
It's interesting because I was reading, and it seems like having a lot of different perspectives might be a good thing for a social contract, right? It makes it stronger.
Oh, that's an important point. It means we don't all have to think exactly alike, but it's that division of cognitive labor where everyone brings different strengths and ideas that makes the social contract more adaptable, more robust.
It's like a healthy society needs a whole chorus of voices, not just one single note.
I love that image. So now we come to the third element, modeling agreement, which gets into how these hypothetical people we've been talking about actually reach an agreement.
Right, because there's no actual contract signing going on here. So how do we know what these people would agree to?
And this is where modern philosophers have gone beyond just that basic idea of consent. They're using tools like game theory and even evolutionary biology to model how agreements can actually emerge. Wow, game theory and evolutionary biology, that's a lot more complicated than I was expecting.
Right, it's we're taking these old philosophical ideas and throwing in some like cutting-edge science to try to understand how societies work.
Yeah, exactly. So let's break down these different approaches to modeling agreement a little bit. One is bargaining. So you can imagine these rational individuals trying to figure out how to divide the benefits and burdens of living together, fairly. It's kind of like splitting a pie, but instead of slices of pie, you're talking about like rules and rights and responsibilities.
Okay, so finding that sweet spot where everyone gets a piece, but nobody feels like they got it totally screwed over. Does that actually, like, happen in real life, though? I mean, it sounds kind of idealized.
Well, it is a simplified model, but, the core idea is that there's this like negotiation and compromise that has to happen for any society to work, right? And then there's aggregation, which is basically like trying to take everyone's individual preferences and combine them into some kind of overall social choice.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare. How do you even, like, weigh those different values and priorities? It's like trying to plan a dinner party for a bunch of people with totally different tastes. How do you make a menu everyone will be happy with?
You got it. That's a perfect analogy. And it gets at one of the really big challenges of this whole social contract idea, right? How do you balance the needs of the individual with like the need for everyone to agree on something? And then the third approach is equilibrium, which comes from like game theory.
Okay, equilibrium. That one always makes my brain hurt a little. Can you maybe, like, give me the ELI 5 version?
Sure. So think of it as like finding a stable point in a system where nobody really wants to change what they're doing, even if it's not like the perfect outcome for them. One of the classic examples is the stag hunt game. Have you heard of that one?
Oh yeah, the stag hunt. It's all about like choosing between cooperating to get a bigger reward or going it alone for a smaller but safer payoff, right?
Exactly. It's a great metaphor for the tension between self-interest and, what could be achieved if everyone worked together. And we see this playing out in real life all the time, too.
Oh, absolutely. Like think about international agreements on climate change, for example. Each country might be tempted to put their own economic interests first, but the only way to actually solve the problem is for everyone to work together. Or, like arms races. Everyone wants to be safe, but by trying to make themselves individually more secure, they end up making everyone less safe in the long run.
Great examples. And they really highlight how these models, even though they're abstract, can give us some real insight into how human societies actually work, with all the good and the bad.
Totally. So we've talked about these different ways of modeling agreement, bargaining, aggregation, equilibrium, but it feels like it all comes down to, like, what are these hypothetical people actually agreeing on? Is it just about, like, basic laws and stuff, or is it something bigger?
That's the key question. And it takes us to the fourth element that the Stanford Encyclopedia talks about, the object of agreement. Basically, it's about defining what the social contract is supposed to cover, like what's on the table when these imaginary people are making their deal.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Is it just about setting up a government and making sure there's, like, some basic law and order?
Well, that's definitely the traditional focus, especially for people like Hobbes and Locke. They were all about the legitimacy of political power and the duty of citizens to obey the state. But it can actually be way broader than that.
So it's not just about avoiding anarchy. It's about figuring out what makes a society just and fair in a more, like, fundamental way.
Yeah. Think about a philosopher like John Rawls, for instance. He said that the social contract should actually encompass the entire basic structure of society, like the economy, family structures, even our understanding of rights and freedoms. He wasn't just trying to keep the peace, he was trying to create a world where everyone has a fair shot at a good life.
So instead of just setting the rules of the game, we're talking about designing the playing field itself, right? Making sure it's level and fair for everyone who steps onto it.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And then there are even more expensive views of the social contract. Some people think it should be about justifying moral principles themselves, like these universal rules that everyone should follow no matter who they are or where they come from.
Wow, so it's not just about our relationship with the government, but like how we treat each other as human beings, right?
Exactly. It's recognizing that we're all connected and trying to figure out how to create a world where everyone can thrive.
This is all super fascinating, but I got to be honest, my head's spinning a little. Like, even if we can imagine what this perfect social contract looks like, what does it actually mean for us in the real world? Does it change anything?
That is the million-dollar question. And it leads us to the fifth and final element. What does the contract show? It's about figuring out what the implications of this whole social contract idea are. Like, how do we actually use it to understand the world?
Okay, so what are the different interpretations of what the contract actually shows? Like, what are the different schools of thought on that?
So one view is called the constructivist perspective. And basically, it's the idea that The social contract doesn't just reflect some like pre-existing moral truth. It actually defines what's just and moral. It's saying morality is a human creation, something we build through agreement.
So morality isn't like, written in the stars or handed down from on high. It's something we invent through reasoning and negotiation.
Exactly. And then there's the indicative view, which is a little more, I guess you could say, modest. It sees the social contract as a useful tool for figuring out what's justifiable, but it doesn't say it's the be-all and end-all. There might be other reasons for things being right or wrong besides this hypothetical agreement.
Okay, so it's more like a guidepost than a set of absolute rules. Like, it points us in the right direction but doesn't tell us exactly where to go.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even philosophers who don't completely buy into the whole social contract thing, they still use the model to help them think through ethical and political issues. It forces you to ask, like, what can we reasonably expect other people to accept and why? It's a framework for thinking about like how much individual freedom we should have and what we owe to each other.
It's like a mental workout for our moral compass, helping us to really think through those big questions about how we should live and what kind of society we want to create.
Love that. And it gets at why social contracts theory is still so relevant today. It's not just some abstract philosophical puzzle. It's a way of understanding and maybe even changing the world around us.
All right, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've been digging deep into social contract theory, and wow, it's been a wild ride. We started with why we follow rules, and now we're talking about like game theory and evolution to understand how those rules came to be.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how much this theory has to offer, how it can be looked at from so many different angles. And actually, there's still more to uncover. We need to go back to those models of agreement we talked about earlier: bargaining, aggregation, and equilibrium.
Oh, you're right. Those are the parts that really made my brain sweat, especially bargaining. Like, at first glance, it seems pretty simple, right? Just get everyone together in a room and let them hash out a deal.
Yeah, but it's not quite that easy. Remember, these are hypothetical people, perfectly rational. They're not going to just roll over and accept anything. They're going to try to get the best deal for themselves while also making sure the outcome is fair and, stable.
Right, so it's like this high-stakes negotiation where everyone's trying to come out on top. But how do you even model that kind of complexity? Like, where do you even start?
That's where game theory comes in. It gives us a way to like mathematically analyze these strategic decisions and see how different bargaining situations might play out.
Oh, game theory. I remember learning about the prisoner's dilemma back in college. Is that kind of similar to what we're talking about here?
Totally. The prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of how like acting in your own self-interest can actually backfire and lead to a worse outcome for everyone. And in the context of social contract theory, game theory helps us figure out what conditions make cooperation more likely, even when everyone's kind of looking out for themselves.
So it's like designing a system where cooperating is not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. Like, you get rewarded for playing by the rules.
Exactly. And one thing that's super important is the disagreement point. Basically, what happens if those hypothetical people can't reach a deal? If the consequences of failing to agree are really bad, like ending up in a chaotic state of nature, then people are more likely to be willing to compromise.
So a little bit of fear can actually be a good thing. Like, it motivates people to cooperate.
Well, yeah, in a way, but it's not just about fear. The balance of power between the different parties also matters a lot. If one side has a lot more power than the other, whether that's because they have more resources or more knowledge or more social influence, then they're probably going to be able to get a better deal for themselves.
Right. Sounds just like the real world, doesn't it? Those power dynamics always seem to creep in.
Yep. And it makes you think about, like, is a social contract really legitimate if it's mostly just reflecting the interests of the most powerful people?
Deep stuff. Okay, so what about aggregation? What's that all about?
So aggregation is about trying to come up with a solution that reflects what the group as a whole wants, even if it's not anyone's perfect ideal.
So like finding that middle ground that most people can live with, even if it's not their first choice. Is it kind of like voting?
Yeah, good analogy. It's like taking everyone's preferences and somehow combining them into a single outcome. But just like with voting in real life, there are a lot of challenges. Like, how do you decide which preferences are more important than others? What if there's a tie? And how do you make sure that minority voices aren't just completely ignored?
Man, it sounds like trying to herd cats. How do you get everyone on the same page when everyone has a different idea of what the right page even is?
Right. It's tough, but thinking about these challenges can actually help us understand how we make decisions as a society. How we try to find that collective will.
All right, now for the one that really makes my head spin, equilibrium.
Equilibrium, when we're talking about social contracts, means finding a set of rules where everyone's better off sticking to them than trying to cheat or break them. It's like a state of balance where no one has a reason to mess things up.
Got it. So you're creating a system that basically polices itself because it's in everyone's best interest to play by the rules.
Exactly, but remember the stag hunt we talked about before. There can actually be multiple different equilibria, different sets of rules that are all stable in their own way. So then the question becomes, which one is the best? Like, which one is the most just and beneficial for everyone?
Oh, man, that's tricky. It's like you're in a maze with multiple exits, but only one of them leads to the good ending. How do you pick the right path?
That's where things get super interesting. Some philosophers have guided using evolutionary game theory to explain how some of these equilibria might emerge naturally, without anyone actually planning it that way. It's like natural selection for social norms, where the strategies that work best for cooperation end up surviving and spreading.
So it's not like the social contract is this fixed thing. It's more like it's constantly changing and adapting based on what works and what doesn't.
Exactly. It shows how dynamic this whole idea of the social contract really is. It's not about finding one perfect solution for everyone. It's about creating a system that can evolve and adapt over time.
Man, this has been an awesome deep dive. We've covered so much ground, it's hard to keep track of it all. But I still have this one question in the back of my mind. Like, if these social contracts are all just hypothetical, what's the point? What are we supposed to do with this in the real world?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one we should all be asking ourselves after exploring this stuff, because even though these contracts are theoretical, they can really change how we think about, justice, morality, how individuals relate to society, all those big ideas.
Okay, but how do we take these abstract ideas and turn them into something real? Like, what does it actually mean to live in a way that's consistent with this idea of a social contract?
Think of it like this. Social contract theory gives us a way to look at the rules we live by and ask, are they fair? Do they actually reflect what people want? Or are they just based on force or tradition or whatever?
So it's like holding up a mirror to society and saying, hey, are we actually living up to our own ideals? Are we honoring those unspoken agreements that, like, bind us together?
Exactly. And if the answer is no, then social contract theory gives us the tools to demand something better. It gives us a way to challenge unjust laws, to fight for equality, to create a society that actually respects everyone.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. A philosophical theory that can actually spark social change.
Right. It shows that philosophy isn't just some ivory tower thing. It's something that can really make a difference in the world.
Well said. Well, folks, that's going to do it for this episode of The Deep Dive. As you go about your day, think about those unspoken social contracts that are all around you. Are you getting a fair deal? Are you holding up your end of the bargain? And if you could redesign society from scratch, what would your social contract look like?
Those are some great questions to ponder. And remember, the journey doesn't end with this episode. It starts with the critical thinking and the, self-reflection that this whole theory inspires.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on the philosophical adventure, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.